We're going to take you live. We've been waiting for this press conference. Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Earlier this week, President Trump took decisive action to call on Turkish forces to stand down, to end the violence, to agree to negotiations. And today, I'm proud to report, thanks to the strong leadership of President Donald Trump and the strong relationship between President Erdogan and Turkey and the United States of America, that today the United States and Turkey have agreed to a ceasefire in Syria. The Turkish side will pause Operation Peace Spring in order to allow for the withdrawal of YPG forces from the safe zone for 120 hours. All military operations under Operation Peace Spring will be paused, and Operation Peace Spring will be halted entirely on completion of the withdrawal. Our administration has already been in contact with Syrian Defense Forces, and we have already begun to facilitate their safe withdrawal from the nearly 20-mile wide safe zone area south of the Turkish border in Syria. Let me say this also includes an agreement by Turkey to engage in no military action against the community of Kobani. And in addition, the United States and Turkey have both mutually committed to a peaceful resolution and future for the safe zone, working on an international basis to ensure that peace and security defines this border region of Syria. In addition to the settlement today with the ceasefire, Turkey and the United States mutually committed to the defeat ISIS activities in northeast Syria. This will also include an agreement renewed today to coordinate efforts on detention facilities and internally displaced persons in formerly ISIS-controlled areas. Also, Turkey and the United States agreed on the priority of respecting vulnerable human life, human rights, and particularly the protection of religious and ethnic communities in the region. I spoke to President Trump just a few moments ago, and I know the President is very grateful for President Erdogan's willingness to step forward and to enact this ceasefire and to give an opportunity for a peaceful solution of this conflict that commenced 1 week ago. For my part, I'm grateful for the President's leadership. I'm grateful for the more than 5 hours of negotiations with President Erdogan and his team that arrived at a solution that we believe will save lives. And let me also say I'm very grateful for this team, to be able to have alongside the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, our National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, Ambassador Jim Jeffries, and Ambassador David Satterfield. Was a great privilege. And each of the members of this team contributed equally to achieving this outcome, which is a great contribution to security in this region, and it's a great contribution to the strong and enduring relationship between the United States of America and Turkey. Lastly, I want to express my appreciation to millions of Americans who I know were carrying this moment in prayer. We heard from people all over the country whose hearts were heavy with the loss of life in this conflict over the last week, longed to see it brought to an end. And I believe their prayers, the strong leadership that President Trump provided to this moment, and the cooperation with President Erdogan and Turkey has made this possible. And so again, let me say A week after Turkish forces crossed into Syria, Turkey and the United States of America have agreed to a ceasefire in Syria. It will be a pause in military operations for 120 hours while the United States facilitates the withdrawal of YPG from the affected areas in the safe zone. And once that is completed, Turkey has agreed to a permanent ceasefire, and the United States of America will work with Turkey, will work with nations around the world to ensure that peace and stability is the order of the day in this safe zone on the border between Syria and Turkey. With that, let me recognize Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your great work.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks. I think the Vice President said it well. I just wanted to add this thought. There obviously remains a great deal of work to do in the region. There's lots of challenges that remain, but this effort tonight sets the conditions for the successful resolution of this particular piece, which created enormous risk and a real risk of instability. And President Erdogan's decision tonight to work alongside President Trump to achieve this ends will be one that I think will benefit Turkey a great deal. Thanks. I know you want to take some questions.
Great. Humaira, where are you? Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. How will you overcome the damage that's been caused over the past week? There's been a lot of animosity between U.S. and Turkey. A lot of things have been said, and a lot of threats of economic sanctions have been made. How are you going to repair the relationship going forward? Thank you.
Well, first, as you'll see from the agreement, part of our understanding is that with the implementation of the ceasefire, the United States will not impose any further sanctions on Turkey. And once a permanent ceasefire is in effect, the President has agreed to withdraw the economic sanctions that were imposed this last Monday. But make no mistake about it, President Trump was very clear with our ally, Turkey, about American opposition to Turkish military forces entering Syria. The President made that clear in his discussions and his correspondence with President Erdogan. And I believe that the candor and frankness that President Trump applied to this and the strength of his relationship with President Erdogan both contributed to the ability for this agreement to come about. And now we will work together to implement this agreement. As I said, our team is already working with YPG personnel in the safe zone for an orderly withdrawal outside the 20-mile mark, and we're going to go forward together to bring peace and security to this region. I'm very confident of that. Okay, Gonja Şenay. Gonja, please.
Thank you. Gonja Şenay from TRT World. There are reports by some international organizations on how YPG is treating ethnic and religious minorities in northern Syria. And Christian leaders in Turkey are making calls to the country to ensure peace and security in the region. I'm wondering your thoughts on this.
Well, let the Secretary also address that, but I can tell you that President Erdogan and I spoke at great length about the importance of protecting religious minorities in the region. President Erdogan also shared with me the perspective of many leaders in religious communities here in Turkey who had great concerns about violence and persecution taking place along the border. And so part of our agreement is to continue to work very closely to ensure that religious minorities can thrive and that religious pluralism is one of the characteristics of this safe zone for some time to come. Mr. Secretary.
Not only this, we've certainly heard from the Vice President. I heard from Christian leaders around the world who expressed much of the same concern that you just described. We think this reduction in violence, this ceasefire, reduces the risk of that, so we think this greatly contributes to protecting religious minorities throughout Syria and throughout the broader Middle East as well. This all obviously happens in the context of lots of religious challenges, lots of challenges to religious persecution in Iraq and other places as well. We think this is an important contribution in that regard. The other thing is that we talked about at some length is that to the extent there are abuses that are identified, we'll ask each leader, certainly President Erdogan and his team and others, to investigate any allegations of abuse that have taken place.
And let me maybe add an addendum to that. One of the things I know the President and the American people are most proud of is the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars to help rebuild Christian, Yazidi, and other religious minority communities in the aftermath of the horrifying violence during the ISIS period, both in Syria and in northern Iraq. We'll continue to flow those resources to support those communities. But as you'll see from this agreement, it is a specific undertaking by Turkey and by the United States to ensure to protect religious minorities in the affected region. Sean Tandon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. You mentioned that there's an organized withdrawal of the YPG fighters. Can you explain that a little bit more? You said there's been an agreement with them, where they're going to withdraw to, what do you see of the future of them? And while there are obviously concerns here in Turkey about the YPG and the links to the PKK, many in Washington say, for example, that they led part of the fight against the Islamic State group, against ISIS. What do you see for the future of northern Syria? Do you see any future for the Syrian Kurds politically there?
Well, our commitment with Turkey is that we will work with YPG members, and we also know as Syria Defense Forces to facilitate an orderly withdrawal over the next 120 hours. And let me say that's literally already begun. And where they will be withdrawing from is the demarcation line, roughly 20 miles south of the border. Turkey's willingness to pause and to embrace a ceasefire of military operations to enable us to see to that orderly withdrawal of YPG will, we believe, make it possible for that to occur. And I know it's already underway as we speak. But look, Turkey's had a great concern about their border. And while the United States of America did not approve of their military crossing into Syria, we have always endorsed a safe zone. And it was a matter of discussion and negotiations. And we believe that the Kurdish population in Syria, with which we have a strong relationship, will continue to endure. The United States will always be grateful for our partnership with SDF in defeating ISIS, but we recognize the importance and the value of a safe zone to create a buffer between Syria proper and the Kurdish population and the Turkish border, and we're going to be working very closely. So we think the agreement today first ends the violence, which is what President Trump sent us here to do. I said it again and again to President Erdogan. President Trump sent us here to end the violence and to achieve an immediate ceasefire. Thanks to the agreement that we negotiated today and the strong stand that President Trump took in the preceding days, we've achieved that. We've also achieved an opportunity by working with YPG to move out of the area to create more peace and security and stability in that buffer zone. And we're going to be working very earnestly to accomplish that. We believe that can be accomplished during the 120-hour period, and after which there'll be a permanent ceasefire, and then we'll continue to engage. Again, not militarily. The President made it clear that we're not going to have military personnel on the ground. But the United States will continue to engage diplomatically, politically, and of course in humanitarian aid and support to affect all of the people affected in this region.
Last question.
Go ahead, Recep.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. You mentioned that. The United States. You mentioned the United States opposed Turkey's incursion into northern Syria. But that Erdogan has always wanted a sort of safe zone here. What concessions did you actually get out of President Erdogan? Number one. Number two. Have you gotten specific assurances from the YPG that they will comply with the terms of this agreement? Because this is something that they have said that they would not do. And finally, with the Kurds moving south, and now with the U.S. sanction in terms of them moving south, how would you address critics who would call this potentially a second abandonment of the Kurds?
Well, I think you'll be able to see from the agreement itself what concessions were made. President Trump, in his telephone call with President Erdogan earlier this week, and in the directive that he gave us to deliver, was very clear that he wanted a ceasefire. He wanted to stop the violence. Turkey's engaged in an active military operation. I can tell you that as our discussions began over the course of the 5-hour period of time, we reached a place of agreement about how a ceasefire could benefit Turkey, achieve President Trump's objectives, and also contribute to a peaceful resolution of the safe zone. And I believe that we've accomplished that. With regard to the YPG, the Syrian Defense Forces, we have been in contact today, and we have received repeated assurances from them that they'll be moving out, that they greatly welcome the opportunity for a ceasefire, to make a safe and orderly withdrawal from those areas in the safe zone where they still have a presence. And we're very confident that that's already taking place, and we're going to be using all the leverage that we have of having fought alongside Syrian Defense Forces in the battle against ISIS to facilitate their safe withdrawal. But we think this is an outcome that will greatly serve the interests of the Kurdish population in Syria. It'll greatly serve the interest of Turkey, and it'll create the kind of long-term buffer zone that will ensure peace and stability in the region.
Mr. Vice President, just want to follow up on that question. What specific concessions did Turkey receive? Specifically, I want to ask you if they brought the issue up of the bank, Halk Bank, rather.
Not in the context of these negotiations. I think when we had concluded the negotiations, the topic was raised, and we informed them that that was a matter for the Southern District of New York and the Justice Department. But let me say the concessions that the United States made have to do with the fact that the President had made it clear that if there had not been a ceasefire today, there would have been a new round of massive sanctions against Turkey. And you'll see in the agreement that on the basis of the pause of 120 hours, a ceasefire over the next 5 days, that we will not be implementing additional sanctions during that period of time. Once we have a permanent ceasefire, following the orderly withdrawal of all YPG forces, the United States also agreed to withdraw the sanctions that were imposed on several cabinet officials and several agencies earlier this week.
To be clear, though, just to nail this down, so it was simply the sanctions that would be removed. Nothing else was offered or given to the Turks.
Right.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. One more question, Mr. Vice President.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. While you were here negotiating with the Turks for several hours, both of you, Can I finish real quick? Wait.
You're using the YPG as using the sanctions as a blackmail against your NATO ally for the sake of PKK YPG terrorist organization. This is a clear question, Mr. Vice President.
The United States of America did not support Turkey's military action in Syria. President Trump made that very clear to his friend President Erdogan. And the United States imposed sanctions earlier this week. And the President made it clear yesterday, and we made it clear again today, that there would be additional sanctions coming to bring an end to the violence, to the loss of innocent lives in this border conflict. That being said, let me say, I really believe today's ceasefire is a credit to President Trump and to President Erdogan. It's a credit to the strong relationship between the United States and Turkey. It's also a credit to the strong relationship between our two leaders. I mean, where there are differences between friends, it's important that friends let their feelings be known. President Trump did that in this case. But it facilitated us being able to reach an agreement that has now resulted in a ceasefire, and we believe will set the stage for creating a peaceful and stable, a safe zone, and the United States is committed to achieving that for all the people of this region.
Mr. Vice President, can I finish my question that I started, please?
All right, that was a much-awaited press conference with Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. They have officially announced that the U.S. and Turkey have reached a ceasefire. I want to bring in Christina Ruffini by phone, our State Department and Foreign Affairs reporter. So, Christina, I know that the ceasefire terms are 120 hours before this takes place. If you do the math, that's 5 days. Why do they give them 5 days, and why isn't this immediate?
I think they need to make sure it's going to work, right? They need to, what they said is the 120-hour pause while the U.S. helps facilitate the withdrawal of the YPG. And the vice presidents did refer to them as the YPG, which is interesting because until this point, they had been calling them the SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces. The YPG is a name you hear used by Turkish officials more often than previously you had by American officials. And that's because the Turks think of them as a terrorist group, whereas the U.S. were allies with them in the war against ISIS. So they want 120 hours to see if the ceasefire holds, to safely evacuate the YPG, which are those militias that fought with the U.S. against ISIS, out of this safe zone. And once that's agreed to, they said they're going to work on a permanent ceasefire and a more permanent solution and a safe zone for this region, because the vice president said the United States recognizes the need to have a buffer area between Kurds and the Turkish border.
When you look at ceasefires, particularly when you compare it maybe to the Middle East, they usually try to be effective immediately. They don't always hold. What gives the vice president, the White House, the State Department confidence that this ceasefire will hold? What are the assurances that they have?
Well, they have said, if the Turks don't hold to their end of the ceasefire, they're going to instigate that second round of massive crushing sanctions, and that's the threat that's kind of been hanging over their head. Towards the end of the press conference, one of the journalists in the room very smartly asked what the concessions the U.S. gave the Turks to get them to agree to this ceasefire were, and the vice president said there weren't any other than the fact that they agreed to hold off on putting more sanctions on Turkey, and if the ceasefire holds and they feel like they're working towards a stable, permanent solution, the U.S. will be willing to talk about lifting the sanctions that are already put in place.
And at this point, what does this mean for the Kurds, who have been a major ally for U.S. in many instances, from our invasion of Iraq in 2003 to present day?
It's hard to tell where this will end permanently, because what wasn't said in this press conference is, okay, there's a ceasefire, but they didn't use the word withdrawal, right? They're not requiring that Turkey remove all of its forces that have pushed past the border into this buffer zone, if you want to call it that, about 20 miles in from the border. So yes, they're giving them time to get the Kurdish forces out, but the vice president said, we will be grateful to the FDS. We will always be grateful for helping us defeat ISIS, but we recognize the need to find a safe zone between the Kurdish population and the Turkish border, and we think the agreement today ends the violence, which is what the president sent us here to do. So basically he's saying that the most important thing is to end the violence now and not really address where the Kurds go or whether they will have any political solution or territory to call their own in this region going forward.
Yeah, it sure seems that way. Pence was asked by CBSN contributor and reporter Zeke Miller, who said that, he doesn't know when asked specifically, how some people refer to this as a second abandonment of the Kurds, and he didn't really seem to answer his question about what this means for the Kurds particularly.
No, he didn't. And it's the Kurds have had a fraught relationship with the United States. It seems like every administration does their own version of not completely living up to the promises that we've given them in various different conflicts, including Iraq and now Syria. But it's interesting to watch the Vice President and the Secretary of State come out and kind of declare victory here and say this is down to the great relationship between Presidents Trump and Erdogan. And Vice President Pence thanked President Trump multiple times for his great leadership and said this was only possible because of him. But what wasn't said is if these two had such a great relationship and if they are such great allies, why couldn't the U.S. stop this from happening in the first place? This should never have happened if the U.S. was able to exert the influence they are now claiming they have over their great ally, the Turks.
And just moments before this press conference took place, Mick Mulvaney was in the White House press briefing room addressing reporters, and he was asked, are you confident that that meeting between Erdogan and the president will take place in the White House? I believe it's November 13th or so. And he said, we'll have to wait and see. So are you confident? Do we believe that this paves the way for the meeting that was scheduled between the two?
I think it's more likely now than it was 30 minutes ago. I think we'll have to see what the next 120 hours bring. I know the Turks have been reticent to say that, the meeting is off. They are saying the same thing. We'll see, we'll see. I think both these leaders believe in hip-check diplomacy and believe in face-to-face meetings and want to do things themselves. And I think both these men want to be in the room with each other. It'll just be a matter of whether the political winds are blowing in the right direction domestically for them to be able to justify meeting face-to-face.
Christina Ruffini, thank you so much, Christina, for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
You bet.